none of you guys are on the stream, so we don't have image rights for you yet. I have very expensive image.
All right, Dr. Grabowski, philosopher from Rogers State University.
Yeah.
Cyclist.
Yeah. Recovering.
Just
Yeah.
working ahead.
Getting better.
Okay, it's great to have you here.
Thank you. I was here last year, so I'm not sure how many who are here today. We were here last year when we talked about language.
Talk about language.
Effectiveness of language, communication,
Yeah.
right? So, yeah. Anyhow, so did you want?
You want to have more of a talk than
Yeah,
like
I'll tell you briefly a little bit about myself here in a minute, but I really want this to be a conversation. This is not a lecture. I already taught my class today, so I don't want to have to teach another class if I don't have to. But just as an introduction, yeah, I'm Frank Grabowski. I teach philosophy at Rogers State University. I've been there for the better part of 15 or 16 years. I'm a tenured professor. My area of specialty is ancient philosophy, so I do mainly Plato and Aristotle. But I'm an intellectual, and I like to think that I have something to say about other matters. I recently published an article in Crisis magazine. I'm not sure if anybody reads Crisis, so I did a short little write-up on the Church of Woke. Father Bowler out in New York had an interesting prayer that I argued, in fact, was parody in an instance of liturgical use. So if you're interested, look that article up. It's on the Crisis website. But today and next week, we're going to talk a little bit about capitalism and socialism. So Gerald and I, over the summer, we were kind of chatting about some possible topics of conversation, and we agreed that there's a lot of debate about whether we should adopt more of a socialist system of economics, whether the debate about a single payer health care or health insurance plan, unemployment, whether there should be universal employment, some means of whereby the government would pay you money to either work or not work, or so to what extent should the government be involved in maintaining basic services for people? And so I thought, okay, well, that's all well and fine, but if we're going to talk and think about this as Catholics, we have to frame this in a certain way. And so ultimately, I would like to consider, based on the Catholic view of man, of the two systems, which better fits our lives, both as individuals and as communal animals. But to get to that point whereby we might look at some church documents and see what opinion the church has advanced, we've at least got to get a few things straight about what capitalism is and socialism is. And so this what I have here is an incredibly oversimplified way of looking at capitalism and socialism, because there are a lot of gray areas. Should be considered, are we a socialist nation? Are we a capitalist nation? But before getting into all of this, has anybody here ever given any serious thought to these concepts? Capitalism, does anybody here consider themselves capitalists? Does anybody here have any investments? Do you invest in the stock market?
Stones.
Yeah, I have some investments, and I have a 401k, and so of course, my livelihood today and my future livelihood, potential family's livelihood, depends on how much money other companies make and whether my investments today will appreciate or depreciate. And so the way our system is currently set up, certainly, I want companies to profit. Right? I want them to create jobs. But then again, there are many people out there who are underprivileged and who don't have access to health care, and who may not be employed with the coronavirus and all. And so the question then becomes, well, what is the government's role in helping these people out? And so I thought, well, let's just first of all ask the question, what is the difference between capitalism and socialism when we talk about these two concepts? And so, again, this is just a very general. I'm painting this in very, very broad strokes, but I thought that we could start here, and then if you guys have anything to add, or if you have any questions, we can talk through this together. Okay, so let's start with capitalism. Well, what is capitalism? Well, again, the basic idea behind capitalism is that, well, we exist in a society whereby we can exchange goods and services more or less freely, in the sense that, right, I may provide a service or I may produce a good, and I leave that good out in the open to be purchased. So I may set a price, or other people may set a price when we negotiate. So what I've written here is just basically capitalism is an economic system under which the means of production are privately owned. And the means of production can be anything from a factory to a sewing machine, right? I mean, it's something big. A coffee maker, right? I own the means of production. I produce coffee. I knit sweaters. I manufacture cars. And what I go on to say here is that the so-called free market, right, which is governed by the laws of supply and demand, determines the levels of production and sets prices of goods and services. So what do we mean by supply and demand? Well, I illustrate this with a few examples, but the basic idea here is that out there in the market, out there floating in the market, are certain amounts of goods and services. And there's going to be a certain demand for these goods and services. If I make something that many, many people want, then if I produce a certain number of these items over a period of a week or over a period of a year, then depending on what the demand for that item is, that'll determine the price of the item, right? So if what I go on to say is that, if you look at wages, for instance, well, how are wages on? So I earn a salary, Gerald earns a salary, all of you, when you graduate, you're eventually all going to earn salaries, and then the question becomes, well, what am I worth, right? What should I be paid? And of course, everybody wants to be paid 6 figures, 7 figures, but the question is, are people really worth that much money? So everyone always likes to say about teachers that we do the most important job. And I always like to hear that, right? We do the most important job. And then the implication is that because my job is so valuable that I ought to be paid lots and lots of money, which I would not disagree with. The fact of the matter is teachers are not paid very well, I would say generally speaking, right? I mean, there are exceptions. But when you look at, say, like athletes, right? If you take somebody like Djokovic or LeBron James, and these people make incredible amounts of money. And we're not talking just about what they make with their sponsors, but I mean, their sport teams pay them many millions of dollars. And so the question then becomes, well, why does LeBron James make millions of dollars, but Dr. Grabowski tens of thousands of dollars? That seems unfair, right?
Keeps up at night.
Right, right, it really does. Well, I mean, there's a simple explanation using just basic supply and demand, free market economics. So what I've written here is that if the demand for a job is high and the number of available workers is low, then that'll drive up the wages, right? So
like a cricketer in the United States doesn't make any money.
No, because the demand.
Even though it might be the best cricketer.
We have no cricket team.
Nobody wants to watch it.
Right, exactly. But if you're really good at dribbling a basketball, or dunking a basketball, or throwing a touchdown pass, and you might say, well, but we've got tons and tons of quarterbacks. I mean, look at all these colleges; they're producing all these quarterbacks, and so isn't the supply very high? Well, yeah, the supply.
It's artificially restricted by the league.
But we're talking quality, right? So that's the other thing we have to factor into this, is that when we talk about the number of available workers, we're talking about the number of available basketball players that can dunk a basketball, shoot a three-point shot at 50% accuracy, right? Average, and for football players. So the question is, well, how many LeBron Jameses are there out there? How many Tom Brady's are there out there? The answer is, well, very few. One, right? Maybe a handful. But how many people are out there who can do what I do? Well, I mean, I would like to think that I'm unique, at least my mom tells me that. On the phone that I'm her special boy. But look,
a couple thousand.
yeah, if I were to drop dead tomorrow,
There's a lot of
yeah, it wouldn't take long at all for them to replace me. And again, that isn't to say that they would necessarily do the same quality job that I do, but it just they would be able to meet sort of the minimal job requirements. And so wages are determined by the number of people out there who can do the job at a certain level, but also the demand for that job, right? As you said,
they might just shut down the department.
Well, that would be a shame. But yeah, I mean, if there's no demand for cricketers out there,
Yeah.
then you could be the best cricketer in the world, and there would be nobody out there who would want to pay you anything because the demand is non-existent. And the same supply and demand curve explains what products cost. High demand and low supply drives up the cost, whereas low demand and high supply will lower it.
We've seen this recently with the hand sanitizer,
Toilet paper,
whatever.
right? Go on and sell this on eBay for like $50.
But then it just plummeted down.
Sure.
The supply kept up.
Sure.
Demand.
Sure. And again, you might say, well, who on earth would want to spend $50 on a roll of toilet paper? I mean, you may look at a baseball card or a comic book and say, I wouldn't pay $10,000 for Action Comics #1 or however much it costs. Super comic. But I mean, again, there are people out there who are willing to spend that much money on it. And so, the question really then becomes, well, who sets the price? Well, a lot of people think that the company, the business, sets the price. And they put the price tag on the product, but it's really the consumer who sets the price because they're the ones who are willing to buy the product. And so if I put a $5 million price tag on this phone, right, you may say, well, I set the price, but if nobody buys it, then I'm going out of business. And so I really need to look to my customer, and I have to work out what they're willing to pay. Now, you may be willing to pay $2 for this. Of course, that would also put me out of business because the labor and the materials cost more than $2.
And we can see this more for non-mass marketed things. So like, when you buy a house, there's going to be some negotiation between how much you think it's worth and how much it's selling it's worth.
Right. So
and how much the market's going to come in and swoop if you're too late.
So there's this interesting dance then between the businessman and the consumer to work out, right? Because the consumer wants to try to spend the least amount of money. He wants a deal. But the businessman wants to maximize his profit. And so the businessman doesn't want to set the price higher than the customer is willing to pay. But it goes the other way too. I mean, the customer doesn't necessarily want to pay more. So if the price is set too low, the customer may buy it, but that's going to hurt the businessman. Likewise, if the businessman places it too high, then that would drive the customers away to competitors, which again would put the businessman out of business.
You can see this in regional pricing as well.
Regional pricing too, sure. So in California, property is way more expensive, but again, who sets the cost of the house? Well, in large part, it's the demand. It's the demand for the housing. It's the demand for the product. So again, I think that this is a pretty uncontroversial way of looking at the way that capitalist systems work. I go on to give other examples. Health insurance. What I say is, people acquire insurance by negotiating with private sellers. In some cases, my insurance is provided to me by my employer, but in a free market, you would be able to negotiate with various insurance companies, and those companies would be competing with each other to try to get your business. And so they're lowering their prices, but they're also trying to maintain a certain level of coverage. It's no different with car insurance or any kind of insurance. There's going to be competition.
Is health insurance a little bit unique because we don't negotiate for ourselves. There's less players in the market, whereas car insurance is a lot more individuals.
Well, sure, but there is still. If you're not covered by your company's plan, then you do have to if you want. And I mean,
Yeah.
you know, after the mandate was dropped, now people can opt out and not buy any insurance. But again, there's risk involved there, and that's the other thing too. When you're working out what you do in a capitalist system, there's this question of risk and reward, right? I mean, you might buy a car, right? And you say, well, how much am I willing to spend on a car? Well, this car is $50,000 and this car is $5,000. You may say, well, both have steering wheels and four wheels, and they both consume the same amount of gas, and blah, blah, blah. And you might say, well, then I'll buy the $5,000 car. But of course, the $5,000 car may be less safe. It may have items, luxury items, amenities that the $50,000 car, or that it doesn't have that the $50,000 car does have. And so the question becomes, well, what is the money actually purchasing? What are you willing to live with? What are you willing to live without? So in the case of health insurance, right, I go on to say there's an incentive for a seller to keep premiums low because that'll attract more buyers, but setting costs too high will I think about it, I say we'll get into, or we'll cut into the seller's profits and potentially jeopardize his business. So capitalism is driven largely by self-interest. And that doesn't necessarily mean selfishness, but it's, what am I getting out of it? Sellers want to maximize profits, whereas buyers want to get the most out of their purchase. That is the biggest bang for their buck.
When you see self-interest, you have to. It's not a self-interest like I'm going to publish my autobiography because nobody wants to buy that. I need to find something
Sure.
that
Correct.
appeals.
Correct. You need to invent something, develop some kind of product that people are willing to buy. And you can't force them to buy it at gunpoint. I mean, this needs to be of interest. And oftentimes it'll either fill a need, a gap, so it's a new product, or you'll come up with a product like others in the market, but it improves upon existing products, or it's cheaper. It's cheaper. Right. And so, I don't know, I think that more or less gives you, that's what capitalism is.
Is this more kind of free market stuff, or is this?
Well, sure. Again, I think that to sort of just lay down or establish a foundation, sure, this is a kind of laissez-faire, as they say, free market, Adam Smith sort of way of looking at how markets function. And people who favor capitalism think, well, okay, businesses are in competition, right? One company sells a better product at a cheaper price. Nobody wants to buy products from the other company. What does that mean? That company goes out of business. And a lot of people will say, well, isn't that a bad thing for that company? Well, sure, I guess so. Yeah, in the short term.
We don't want to dress well.
But the hope is that, the idea is that the so-called invisible hand, and this is Smith's idea, is that it will sort of guide the market, and that ultimately we will, technologically, economically, that when all things are said and done, even though companies do go out of business, even though at times money is lost, even though at times you may buy products that break after a month or two of use, that it still produces better products, it produces more advanced technologies, and in the end, produces a higher standard of living overall. So, anybody want to add anything or comment or?
Or one of those hoses, like the stretchy hoses.
What about this
Don't buy it. They're all
those things that you see. Yeah.
Just buy the regular hose.
Just buy a regular hose. They're
Technology
heavy.
is not
Right.
significant.
Right. Now, you might say, well, why not just stick with capitalism, right? It seems like it, to some extent, it works, and we're told that we live in a capitalist nation. Why is there now this growing interest in socialism? Because I was just doing a little bit of online doodling, twiddling, and it does seem, at least among some of the younger generations, including Gen X and the millennials, that there's growing interest, maybe even support of socialism. And so there's several. I mean, Gallup did a poll in 2019. There's this group called Data for Progress. And apparently they polled some folks, and they focused on 4 policies. Single-payer government insurance system, so sometimes called Medicare for all. Number 2, a long-term expansion of unemployment insurance to ensure American workers have income when they lose their jobs. Number 3, the government guarantees a job for all Americans if they can't find one in the private sector. And then 4, universal paid sick and family medical leave. And so they asked folks, what are you supportive of these policies? And surprisingly, over 40% of Gen Xers and over 40% of millennials were in support of all 4 of those. The other generations were below 40%. So many of you are probably Gen Zers. You guys were around 40. Boomers were around 30%, and the silent generation, people who were born before 1945, that they were around 20%. So old timers, they don't like socialism all too much. But young people are sympathetic, right? Or at least they were in favor of those 4, right, policies that are often considered to be socialist.
What was it? Single-payer healthcare.
Single-payer healthcare, long-term expansion of unemployment,
Guaranteed job.
And then universal paid sick and medical leave.
Okay.
So, and of course, well, this poll apparently I think was taken back in June. So, right in the middle of coronavirus, and so people are losing their jobs. And I think that when people are not having a source of income, when they lose their source of income, or when members of their family become ill and the medical bills start to pile up, you may see growing support of these sorts of policies. When things are going well and nobody's getting sick and you're making a lot of money, then you're a good dialectical capitalist. But since people are self-identifying more and more, I mean, I don't want to say more and more, but I mean, I've run into my colleagues because I'm a professor, and I don't know if you're aware of this, but the higher education is very widely dominated by left-leaning professors, and many of whom, especially in the social sciences, identify as Marxists. So
that's empirical.
Oh no, I'm not making this up. I mean, this is well documented, and it's not just anecdotal, although it is anecdotal. I mean, I've met them, but there are also those that I haven't met. And so, I think that it sort of stands to reason, or at least it begs the question, like, okay, well, what is socialism? When people say they're socialists, what are they really saying, or do they understand what they're saying? So this, again, is just, I'm trying to draw a contrast here between capitalism and socialism. Capitalism, again, is governed by these laws of supply and demand, and people want products. They don't want to pay a high price for products, but they want high quality products. And so companies are competing for their business. And so some companies are going to survive, and other companies will fail. And the hope is that the companies that fail, that these people reinvent themselves. It's called creative destruction, where if I make horse-driven carriages, and Henry Ford develops a horseless carriage, and I'm put out of business, then I don't then just become some kind of panhandler, but I try to create some device that will compete with Henry Ford. That's the basic idea. That's why a lot of people are against the government subsidizing failed industries, because all you're doing is propping up companies that aren't feasible, that aren't sustainable. All right, so what then do we mean by socialism, or what is typically meant by socialism? Okay, so socialism is an economic and political system under which the means of production are publicly owned. The government controls the levels of production. It sets prices of goods and services. Now, I understand some people might say, well, wait a second, though. There can be socialist elements within a government or within an economy. It doesn't have to be all government. That's true. Gerald and I were talking.
Is there any that isn't like some kind of little mix?
There's always, I think, going to be a mix, or it's going to exist on a spectrum.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, there are those who would argue that Social Security is a socialist system because I'm paying into it, and the idea is that
You have to.
right, I have to pay into it. Right, if I don't, then I'm taxed on it. But I pay into it, and the government holds it, and then will give it back to me. It's it's a lockbox. It's a lockbox. They take my money because the assumption is somehow that I'm not very good at saving my money because I'm just going to spend it all on booze and women.
Well,
which I might, but right. But then the government will, save me from myself, and then I won't just simply waste all of my money away. And then down the road, they will say, okay, well, here's the money that you had given us so many years ago. So I think Social Security is an example of this. But again, if we can go through the same instances that we had gone through when discussing capitalism, how our wages determined. Well, there's a very famous line from Karl Marx, from each according to his abilities to each according to his needs. So I know this is going to sound vague, but the idea is that you get what you need. If you're a family of 4 and you need 2 loaves of bread, then you get 2 loaves of bread.
it sounds very Catholic.
Yeah, if you're a family of 12, then maybe you get 3 or 4 loaves of bread. So you don't have people then who are hoarding or who are hoarding toilet paper, or who are hoarding it only to gouge other people. So there isn't this sort of competition. The government more or less sets up a system in which people get what they need, and not more, not less. If goods are available for purchase, the price is set by the government. So you don't have the supply and demand working out how much something is worth. The government more or less sets the price because they also own, in many cases, the means of production.
It's usually only one good, so if you want to catch up.
Yeah, and that's always been a kind of a joke that it sometimes changes from Gorbachev to Khrushchev, some of these old Russian prelates. But the joke was that they would come to the United States and they would be taken to a grocery store and they'd be shown the cereal aisle, and they would see all of these different cereals, all these different brands and flavors, and what they couldn't understand is how all of these different cereals managed to sort of make their way onto the shelf because they couldn't imagine the government coordinating all this.
Yeah, what they do.
Yeah, because if you want, and this is where if you're on the government dole and you are given like government cheese, you don't get your choice of cheese. You don't say like I want blue cheese or I want Camembert or I want Python cheese sketch. You go through all the various cheeses. No, you get yellow cheese, and it comes in a block, and it sort of melts nicely.
Which is still kind of true. You get, it's like if you're on assistance.
Right.
But
And so it's the same with insurance. Socialist countries don't really have a need for health insurance per se. Healthcare is free or it's subsidized by the government, so you don't have to buy health insurance.
It's like a national health service.
Right, it's a national health service. UK has something like this. Canada has something like that. And so socialism, whereas capitalism is largely driven by self-interest, socialism is driven largely by the idea that competition and pursuit of profit give rise to inequality. Right? Because again, you have winners and losers. You have people who are making millions of dollars, and then you have poor little philosophers who are, barely have a couple of pennies to rub together. That's often thought of, or it's described in terms of a wealth gap. So you often hear about this, how there's a growing wealth gap in our country, where you have the very, very uber wealthy on the one end, and then you have the rest of us on the other. And that this inequality in turn gives rise to a gap in wealth. Right? So, I think that's an accurate depiction. I don't know if anybody would disagree or would want to add anything to that.
Yeah, I like how you split up, how you addressed maybe American, or the maybe socialist aspects of America, like they provide healthcare to low-income earners. Maybe.
Sure.
And I kind of view socialism almost like it could be capitalism with a 100% tax bracket. Like at some point along the progressive
Sure.
tax bracket, so if someone made over 70,000, then they have 100% tax, and
Sure.
then it just gets redistributed. So
Yeah.
even in America, we have a progressive tax bracket, which is somewhat of a socialist
Sure.
outcome if you
Yeah.
make it more extreme. And that's kind of what Bernie was trying to do.
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair way of describing it, and just to maybe add on to that, again, I think that when you're talking about the elderly or the poor or people who suffer from maybe psychological disorders or even addiction, and I think the vast majority of Americans agree that these people ought to be given some kind of assistance. But the question will always be, what is the most effective way of getting that assistance to them? And so I want to get into the more Catholic stuff here in a second, but I think it's helpful when like, because nowadays, we're having this national debate about health insurance. It's really expensive, and now I'm lucky enough to have my employer subsidize my insurance, not the best insurance, but it's something. Something's better than nothing. But there are a lot of people out there, especially during a pandemic, where if they get sick, they're in a lot of trouble. I mean, because those medical bills, trust me, this thing cost me a lot of money. And so, when you get sick, hopefully you'll never get sick, but odds are you are going to get sick, and an ambulance ride or an ER visit or spending a night or two in the hospital can run you in the thousands of dollars. You or your wife gets pregnant, you're talking.
Yeah, but the thing is, it seemed to me that there's a group in the middle like that, but most people are at one end of the spectrum.
True.
So,
Right.
if you're a low-income earner in Oklahoma, you have free health care if you're pregnant or under 18. It's just
Right.
100%.
Right.
Free.
Right.
And we spoke. So I come from we had the National Health Service, and 2 years ago I was driving up from Norman to Tulsa. We stopped in somewhere in Oklahoma City. Had to get the Brahms.
The Brahms has gone down in my estimation. I liked it more at the beginning.
But there were other English people in the Brahms in like the middle of April. What the hell are these guys saying? They're on vacation. Nobody comes to Oklahoma City in April for a vacation. There's a group of people like, why are they vacationing together? It doesn't make any sense. And because of English, I didn't go out and speak to them. But I didn't listen in on that conversation because it would have freaked them out. But I listened in on the conversation, and they were there for cancer treatment for their children. So, you think of Oklahoma City, that's not the place you think of like as the forefront of anything, let alone medical treatment, but had to leave this system and come here to get the best cancer treatment. At the same time, in England, nurses start out at like $30,000. They progress very far, maybe 35. Whereas here, start out at 50, you can get up to 100,000. And so I just wanted to bring up that coverage issue because now Oklahoma has Medicare, just put it in Medicare for more. Do you know the details of that?
I don't.
Does anybody know the details? New Medicare. But to me, it seems like if you're like, you have to be like in your late 20s and earning like minimum wage to kind of not be covered. But everybody else seems to be covered.
Right. And so, with respect, just one brief comment about health insurance. And so I just take my Catholic hat off for a minute and put my secular cap on. So if I'm a secularist, right? If I'm not thinking of this in like terms of faith and Catholic Church teaches about man, and so like, what should we have a single payer? And I think there's some things you have to take into consideration. So I'm not saying that we should have a single payer, but I mean, there are several factors that you need to take into consideration whenever you're setting up any kind of system, and that would include one involving health insurance. And that is, firstly, you have to think in terms of the quality of the product. Okay, so the quality of the health care that is being received. You know, what kinds of procedures are the doctors performing? Are they good at their job, right? And that's going to be impacted by the number of people they see and the number of people who are covered by this health insurance plan. And so there's the quality of the care. There is the quantity, namely the number of people who are being cared for. And then there's the cost. How much is this going to cost us? And when you become my age, you probably know this by now, but money doesn't grow on trees. It just, you don't have an infinite supply of money. And I mean, I'm not trying to be, demeaning in any way, but there are some who think, well, if we just take all the wealth away from the billionaires, then that will be able to fund all of our programs. And we've done the math, and it just simply doesn't work out. You can squeeze every single penny out of Jeff Bezos and Warren Buffett and Oprah Winfrey, and that may pay for your program for a year or two, but since you've already squeezed that lemon dry, they're not going to be making any more money, and so who's going to pay for this 3 years from now, 4 years from now, 5 years from now, 6 years from now? And so when you're, again, thinking about single payer, okay, it's, again, the quality of the care, how well are people receiving health care, how well are they being treated, how many people are being treated, right? Are we talking 100%? Are we talking 50%? Or somewhere in between? And then there's the cost involved to maintain this. And the problem is you can't have all three. You're never going to have all three. So you got to pick two, at most two. And the question is, well, which two? Is it going to be quality and quantity? Is it going to be quality and cost? And I think that we don't necessarily think of it in those terms. We always think like, gosh, we want everything to be cheap and plentiful and really high quality. Isn't that great? We want $1 iPhones, right? Well, you're not going to get a $1 iPhone. And you're not going to get, if you have a heart attack or you have a brain aneurysm, you may not be able to see the world's best neurologist or the world's best cardiologist because he's going to want to see the world's best cardiologist, and I'm going to want to see the world's best cardiologist. And there's only one world's best cardiologist, and he can only work on one patient. And so if all of us end up having heart attacks, he can't operate on all of us at the same time. And so somebody's going to have to see the second world's best cardiologist, and somebody's going to have to see the third world's best cardiologist, and then eventually somebody's going to have to see a mediocre cardiologist because there are only so many of those really good cardiologists out there. Maybe somebody doesn't see a cardiologist. Yeah. So again, this is a complicated matter, and so I think people think about it oversimplistically. And
there's certainly no way that you could just transplant, keep the current system, and just have it paid for.
No. And so, what the socialist way of thinking about it would be, well, we will try our best to set up the system so that it covers everybody, right? And the hope is that the costs are going to be low enough, but odds are the costs probably won't be all that low. But the hope is that more people are covered as a result, which is that's a noble goal.
Sometimes they can be lower, like so if
it's a noble goal.
If a nurse on average earns half the amount in the UK, then yes. But it's like, is there a good in
right? But the problem with the socialist approach is that it often affects the quality because you only have so many doctors and you have a ton of patients. And sometimes it takes a long time for a patient to see a doctor.
Yes, sometimes we've got a waiting list.
The problem with the capitalist approach is that
some people may not even get a waiting list.
Costs are low and quality is high, but there are people who aren't covered, and so they're not even on the list. So the capitalist will argue, well, the invisible hand will guide us through this maze, and it will drive down costs so that more people can buy into it, and I mean, it seems to have worked in some areas, but is it going to work? Because I mean, you know, if anybody here has older parents who are on medications or who've needed to go and see doctors, but I know my parents are getting up there now. They're in their 70s, and it's unbelievable how expensive pharmaceuticals are. And my mom was telling me about some sort of Parkinson's. My dad has Parkinson's. Some sort of pill that costs like $4,000 or $5,000 a month. Like, yeah, I'll just keep the Parkinson's at that point.
Oh, you?
I would, yeah.
You would have some tests, Medicare.
I would.
That age,
I would.
and whatnot.
I just put me in front of my stereo, pour me a whiskey, and buy me a $4,000 bottle of whiskey.
That'll settle you down. But at some point, in 20 years' time, when you get to that age, the price may go up.
Yeah, so, and then the hope is that over time you can have a generic equivalent. And anyhow, but I don't want to get into all that. So I mean, I know we're running out of time.
Okay, let's
so,
get into this.
So yeah, the question that I think is before us as Catholics is, okay, so where should we? I mean, where should our allegiance be? I mean, should we be capitalistic? Should we be socialistic? Yes, the Church has made various pronouncements. We have documents. We'll go through these next week if you're willing to come back. But I thought, as a start, and as a way to frame the problem, I thought, well, let's talk about human nature. So Gerald and I, we thought this would be a good way of framing it, right? So we've got two systems before us, and granted, you can mix them together in various ways. You can have some socialist elements in a largely capitalist system. The question is, well, which of the two better aligns with our nature as having been made in the image of God? And so I thought, okay, well, let's first of all just kind of mention some facts that have been established by the Church that are biblically grounded, that describe who we are as human beings. So I'll go through these quickly because I know all of you are looking forward to watching the debate between Sleepy Joe and Donald Trump. So the first thing is that yes, man is made in the image of God, and I was thinking about this on the way, and there's so many different ways of like rendering this.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering if anybody has any thoughts on whenever we're told that we are made in the image of God, what does that mean? Are we gods? We are not gods. Well, let's let them answer. These are good, intelligent young Catholics.
Took philosophy several years ago.
We all read the Bible. We all go to church. We all listen to Father so-and-so when he homilizes.
Does it mean that we have the ability to choose to love similar to God?
Okay, that may be part of it. I don't think that there's just one answer, because I think that
The Church has given at least three.
Yeah. So, I mean, we're made in God's image. What does that mean? That God has 2 arms and 2 legs. We have inherent dignity, that we're meant for more. Just like, okay. Inherent dignity.
It's why we don't have.
What does that mean, inherent dignity?
Well, I would say
that your life is intrinsically valuable?
that it has a lot of value.
Okay.
We're called to live with standards or to follow God.
Okay. Immanuel Kant would say that people should only be treated as an end and never as a means to an end. So we aren't like tables and chairs, or we're not tools. So that seems right.
Yeah.
What anybody else?
Probably, at least, in the order of creation, man was created as the kind of crowning jewel of God's creation.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that goes along with that inherent dignity that I believe it was David or someone else that brought it up.
Okay. And he was
And
given
we're also made to
dominion.
be stewards.
Yeah, well, right. We're co-participants in the creative endeavor because we're told to, or Adam was told to till and to keep the earth, and so we're not just God's pets, right? Like, I have a pet. I don't ask my cat to vacuum my Or it'd be nice if you did.
But at the same time, we don't have the debate about universal pet insurance.
No, right.
Because we see there's a difference.
So yeah, we're not God's pets. He didn't just throw us in an aquarium and then just
Yeah.
watched us
Yeah.
swim out. No, that's good. Okay. Anything else?
We have free will.
We have free will, and we have reason. I think that's another thing too. That we are rational animals. That just as God rationally brought the cosmos into being, that we too utilize our reason to freely choose which actions to take or not to take. Gerald, did you want to add anything?
I'm trying to think, in one of the encyclicals, John Paul II talks about, I think it's the Mormon sessions on human labor. He talks about God being us being made in the image and likeness of God, in that we labor, we create, He creates.
We do, but He also rests,
He rests.
and we too should rest and worship, right? And so there's this, right? And then because Pieper talks about this, and leisure is the basis of culture. That yes, we were made to work, but we were also made in the sense to worship, to play, to engage in festivities. So I thought, okay, and again,
We're made in community as well.
that's true. We are social animals, and I do mention this later. So just to kind of go through some of these other points, man was made to love God with all of his heart, mind, and strength, and then I had to love his neighbor, to love our neighbors as ourselves. So that's the communal, but that we are made to love God. Again, we weren't just made and then wound up like a mechanical toy and just. So this is in contrast to the sort of deist conception of God, where God just creates the universe and then gets bored with it and kind of just pieces out. Like our Father God created us in order for us to love Him and to worship Him, that we were made for His pleasure, as it is sometimes said. Man is free, okay, right? Man has free will. But yet the Catechism teaches that we are dependent on God. And so we are free to a point, that we have agency, but that we can't create things out of nothing, that we still depend upon God for material sustenance. But yet we still, again, participate in the creative effort. So I can't just create crops out of thin air, but yet I can take seeds and I can take soil and I can mix these things together and produce food for my family. And this, of course, has a certain, there's agency in it. I did it. I take ownership partly in the creative effort, but this is also in large part dependent on the seeds and the soil being available to me, and those, of course, come from God. Again, just to go through a few of these, and so man was made to live communally. And this ties in neatly with loving our neighbors as we love ourselves. That we are not islands. We do not live alone solely by ourselves, but we live with each other. Now,
Do you think because we are individuals, right? That's clear. We are also made to live communally.
Right.
That's clear as well. Do you think socialism is that emphasis on the communal?
Yes.
And capitalism is that emphasis on the individual?
absolutely, and that's it. That's a difficult balancing act. So this is where, maybe at the end of the day we say, yeah, like true laissez-faire capitalism is very damaging to our communal nature, but that socialism robs us of our individuality and our own agency, and that God doesn't just love man, but He loves Gerald, right? And so that's, but I mean, God also loves everyone, right? The general man, and so this is what's I think we struggle with this, and I think that it's really through the wisdom of the church that allows us to kind of sort out a lot of this stuff. So we'll wrap it up pretty quickly here because I know Sleepy Joe and Donald Trump, they're waiting for us. They refuse to start until So Joe's getting sleepy, so we'll be meeting for pour him a cup of Joe. Pour Joe a cup of Joe. So now I lifted this straight out of the Catechism. So I up front, like, this is, I don't want to say I plagiarized it, but like it's a darn good source. And so I turned to the section where Catechism discusses economic activity. And so I kind of summarized the main points that the Catechism makes. And so we'll go through these and then, take questions or make comments, and then you guys can split if you want to stick around, chat. And those of you who want to come back next week, we'll talk more about encyclicals and what some of the major encyclicals written about socialism and capitalism say. 9 points here. Number 1, this is straight from the Catechism. Economic activity and growth and production should provide for the needs of man.
Right.
Okay.
The economy serves man.
Right. The economy serves man. Economic life should not be ordered to secure secondary goods merely. This isn't about power. It's not about wealth. It's about human good, which is like vague and generic, but
It is objective.
it is objective. Correct. So it's not to serve you. It's to serve us. 2, work is not optional, but a duty. So it's not a choice. It's something that we are all required to do to the extent that we can, right? Doesn't mean you have to work 16-hour shifts, but it means that you can't just be a bum. You can't just, be a slacker, be a panhandler, be a parasite on society.
Like Adam.
Huh?
Just trying to think of a Johnny Cash song.
Oh, well, there's a Johnny Cash song for everything. So, this was in fact the original job given to Adam: dress the Garden of Eden and to keep it. That's the way the Dewey Reams puts it. God told Adam to dress the garden and to keep it. Work honors the gifts we've been given and allows us to cooperate in Christ's redemptive work. The Catechism makes that point. So they're extending our daily work to connect up with Christ's redemptive work, which is very beautiful. And again, that's right. 3, man gives value to his labor. Labor doesn't give value to man. So you aren't your job. Right? We often like this. People ask me, "So, what do you do?" And I'm a professor. And then they think, "Oh, well, Grabowski identifies as a professor," and that's true. That's my job. But that's not who I am. I'm more than that. And so this is why I really love Amy Coney Barrett, and when she talked to us about she accepted Donald Trump's nomination, she really laid a great deal of emphasis on her being a mom, her being a parent, which, nowadays, especially among our political and social elites, that's really not something that's given a lot of emphasis, because it's always about what kind of car you drive, how many brunches you eat, how many people you've dated, all this, and it's not about how many kids you have or if you've adopted kids, but again, I think that's critical.
Yes.
Work allows us to fulfill our duty to complete God's creative work, but it isn't what gives us value.
Yeah. And so this is how Joshua would say, sweeping of the street and the performance of the surgery have the same value in the sense
Correct.
that the subject acting on it has the same value.
So why do they get paid differently? It's a good question, right? That's something to talk about. 4, the right of economic initiative. So the Catechism makes this point. We not only should make use of our talents to benefit others, but to also harvest, this is a quote, to harvest the just fruits of our labor. I have a right to my crops. I grew them, darn it. Right? I don't have to just hand them over. I grew the corn. I should consume the corn. I should provide the corn to my family. But there's also this need to, if Gerald doesn't have an ear of corn and his family is hungry, then do I give him an ear of corn? Do I give him 2 ears of corn? Do I let the government take the ears of corn away from me and redistribute the ears of corn? Right. The church, though, makes it clear that I have a right to the fruits of my labor. Okay. 5. responsibility of the state. All economic activity must be conducted within the confines of some institutional or political domain. We don't have anarchy. It's not a state of nature, a Hobbesian state of nature, where people are just a fight of every man against every man.
For everything. Yeah.
Right. Therefore, it is the responsibility of the state to facilitate these activities by protecting individual liberties and private property, while establishing a stable currency and providing efficient public services. So, right, they have to provide a domain in which I can engage in free trade, or free trade up to a point. But then they also have to provide public services like police, law enforcement, right, or mail delivery, or
So roads, and there's a difference between a public service and the means of production.
Correct. Right. So again, it's about balance. Again, a few more here. 6, the responsibility of business enterprises. Profits, while a necessary means to the creation of jobs, should never be valued more highly than persons. Right?
Because the whole point of the economic activity is to serve the human
Right.
being.
The church is not opposed to profit making. Look, I mean, again, it because it understands that when a business makes a profit, they can expand and they can hire more people. And when you employ more people, then you're presumably increasing the level of human well-being and welfare. But the profit should never come before the
At the
person.
expense of the person.
7, access to employment. The church says that society should do what it can to create employment opportunities, but should never engage in discriminatory employment practices. Yeah, a lot of this is sort of prima facie obvious, at least to people living in a civilized society. 8, just wage. The Catechism mentions the church defines a just wage as, quote, the legitimate fruit of work, unquote. Agreement between parties is not enough. There must be fair remuneration for services rendered. So again, you and I might decide that, if you clean my horse stalls, I'll give you $1, right? You're working for like 8 hours a day, or 12 hours a day.
Yeah.
And you're like, sounds good to me. Well, but somebody else might come in and say like, yeah, shoveling shit for $1. That doesn't really seem fair. And so the church makes sure that there should not only be an agreement, but that the agreement should be based upon a just exchange, where what I receive, and that's what I mean by remuneration, it's what I get, that it is a fair compensation for the work that I'm given. And then lastly, the harm of unemployment. The church teaches that since work is a duty, that unemployment wounds man's dignity. Its harms can extend also to a person's family and society as a whole, and so society can't be blind to unemployment.
That's something Pope Francis has been talking about a lot.
Mhm. Yeah.
And when you've been unemployed for a while, you get it.
Right. And so, again, when you look at this through a secular lens, sure, you could make the argument that unemployment is a bad thing because when unemployment rates rise, then you have crime rises. There are all kinds of bad, negative societal effects due to high
Prices
unemployment.
rise. Yeah.
Right, a lot of But I don't want us to think of this simply in terms of, well, is this good or bad from a secular point of view? I want us to really think of this in terms of, as Catholics, and in light of Catholic teaching, to what extent are capitalist principles just? To what extent are socialist principles just? So that's kind of what I wanted to cover today. Does anybody have any thoughts or comments or responses, or anybody thought about this? Is that it?
We'll go part 2 next week. We're just going to chew on this.
Well, yeah, I hope that you guys have some thoughts, or that you Yes, and again, I think you might say, well, why should I think about this? Why is this important? I have tests to study for. And I think that's a good point, right? But again, I think that, just I'm a philosopher and I'm interested in ideas, and I wrestle with these things all the time. And I think that if you vote, that it's important that you understand who you're voting for and what policies, if they implement their policies, what this could potentially do to you, but also members of your family or your friends or society as a whole. And again, this isn't about necessarily applauding for one of these systems and booing for the other. But again, I think that capitalism, for instance, is often, these days, it's thought of in very negative terms. You have organizations out there like Black Lives Matter who say, we want to destroy capitalism. Ibram Kendi recently tweeted that capitalism was, this was within his rant against the Barrett's her adopting 2 Haitian kids. He accused her of being a white colonialist and a white supremacist. I can't remember. It would be it would be consistent with what he said in the past. But no, I mean, people speak very negatively of capitalism, and some people have spoken very favorably of socialism. And I think it's important that we understand
And vice versa.
what they're talking, and vice versa, what they're talking about, so that we know whether or not we should agree with that. And it should always be informed, and we should always sort of see these issues through the lens of our Catholic faith. So that's what I would like to get more deeply into next week, if you're interested in joining me. Okay?
I'm going to be it.
I know you'll be. I don't know if they will. But we'll take a look at some encyclicals, and we'll let the church guide us, because again, I don't think that, for me, human reason alone is enough to settle this dispute.
All right, well, thanks very much for coming.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you, guys. What do you guys have to say next week?
Yeah, we'll head up if anybody wants to join us for
Yeah, for a little bit. I want to see